Good afternoon. Normally, I'll be doing this live stream at 6 p.m. on Sundays because of various factors. That didn't happen this week. We finished our Sunday night Bible study on evangelism a week or so ago, and now we're going to be picking up with another Bible study. When I was asking my wife, talking to her about what should our next Bible study be? She reminded me that Easter is coming up, and of course, when thinking about Easter, the first thing I thought of that would be Easter related that we could do a Bible study on is the book of Ruth. So we're going to start a Bible study in the book of Ruth. Now, one of the things that you need to understand, and this is just sort of foundational, is the Jewish day. You'll see a little bit later on why I'm explaining this up front, but if you read in the book of Genesis, in the 6 days of creation, after every day, the statement is, and the evening and the morning were the first day, the evening and the morning were the second day, and so on and so forth. So we think of a day, we think of from 12 midnight until 12 midnight, and that's our 24-hour day there. But because of the book of Genesis and the way that it states it, that there was evening and then there was morning, the first day, the Jewish people consider the day to end and begin at sundown. So that would start at something like 7 p.m. would be the end of a Jewish day and then the beginning of their next day rather than midnight. That's going to be important a little bit later on. So the book of Ruth. Now, traditionally, the book of Ruth is read on the second day of the celebration of the Feast of Shavuot. Which for us, we would generally read it in our translations of the Bible as the Feast of Weeks. And we're not very far from the beginning of that Feast of Weeks. The Passover was at twilight on the 14th of Nisan, and then the 15th of Nisan was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So if you were to kind of look at our picture here of the day, really, if this were the 14th of Nisan, Passover is right here. It's right there at sundown is really the only day of that is, or the only moment that is actually the Passover, technically. Now, the rest of the feast is often called Passover, and then also this day here is also considered a lot of times to be part of the Passover. Technically, this day is called Preparation Day, when they were getting ready for the Passover. But, and then this, after sundown, would begin the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the other thing about the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is that the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was always a Sabbath. Now, it didn't mean that it was always a Saturday, but it was always a Sabbath. It didn't matter what day of the week it fell on. As soon as the Passover lamb was sacrificed and the Passover part was accomplished, then began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that was a Sabbath, a holy day. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 9 says, "You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the feast of weeks to the Lord your God with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you." So that's pretty clear. They were to, after the harvest of the barley began, they were to begin their count of 7 weeks. And this was the Feast of Weeks. That's pretty clear, but maybe that's a bit too clear. So in Leviticus, it muddies the waters a little bit. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 9 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you first come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. You shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. His grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to the Lord for a sweet aroma. And his drink offering shall be wine, 1/4 of hin. You shall eat neither bread nor parched grain nor fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. Now, why am I talking about all that stuff? Well, this is centering around the harvest of the barley. And so when the first harvesting of the barley was to take place, then they were to begin their countdown to the Feast of Weeks. The countdown of the Feast of Weeks ends right at the Feast of First Fruits. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. But as I read through this, it's not I would be facetious to say, yeah, now you really understand the Feast of Weeks, right? Because it was explained very clearly there. When you look at verse 11, it says that the day after the Sabbath, this sheaf of barley was supposed to be brought to the priest along with the appropriate offering. And then on that day, the counting of the weeks was to begin. So the day after this special Sabbath. But this is where some confusion comes in. Two traditions came from this. Which Sabbath was God talking about? Was it the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread? In other words, was it the 16th of Nisan, if the Passover was on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, and then you have the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that would be the 15th of Nisan, and then 16th of Nisan would be the beginning of the countdown of the Feast of Weeks. Or did God intend that the first day, the first Sabbath, naturally occurring Saturday, if you will, within this time frame, starting here, the first one to occur in that week, was that the Sabbath that God was talking about? Well, the Jews were as confused about this as we would be reading it, or that we are reading it, and so there was an argument, there was a difference of opinion, and of course the two factions that took the two different sides, most likely just because one side took it, they wanted to take the other side, were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees preferred that this the Sabbath that began after that Sabbath began the countdown, be the first occurring Saturday within that 8-day or 7-day period, however you're counting. Whereas the Pharisees wanted the Saturday to be this day. If we were to do, so we got another day here that goes from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. And so then you've got the Jewish day beginning and ending here. So this would be the Jewish day here, from 7 p.m. until 7 p.m. So they wanted the first Saturday to be this one, and so then the countdown would begin here on this day. Well, this was a beautiful illustration right here. So they wanted this to be the Saturday, so the 15th, and then the countdown would begin right here on this day being the 16th of Nisan. So that was the Pharisee position. Now, the Pharisee position was the one that eventually won out. They, in the time of Jesus, the Sadducees controlled the temple, and the Pharisees had more influence in the synagogues. I did not, in my research, find anything that conclusively said that what was being practiced at the time of Jesus was the was the Pharisee or the Sadducee tradition, but I think it stands to reason because we do know that the Sadducees controlled the temple at that time, that the Sadducee tradition was being followed. So that's important. Okay, I'll tell you why that's important in a little bit, but I'll tell you now because that's in my notes to tell you now. Okay, now, so the Sadducees controlled the temple, so what was going to happen every Passover, beginning at sundown on the 14th of Nisan, the first naturally occurring Sabbath, in other words, the first Sabbath, the first Saturday to occur in this, because you have the Passover, then you've got 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first naturally occurring Sabbath, that was the day after that Sabbath. They were to begin the count. The sheaves were to be brought in. What actually ended up happening was that what was called an omer, a certain measurement of grain, was brought into the temple on the day after that first Sabbath, and the countdown to the Feast of First Fruits began. And most of us know the Feast of First Fruits by its Greek name, Pentecost. And Pentecost is the Greek word for 50. So 50 days were to be counted down, and then was the Feast of First Fruits, and that began the wheat harvest. So one reason why the book of Ruth is read at Shavuot is because most of it centers around the barley harvest, centers around this time, which began sometime during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Passover this year, 2020, begins at sundown, April the 7th, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins immediately after that. So most resources that if you looked up, when is the Passover of 2020, it would tell you April the 8th. So Judaism today follows the tradition of the Pharisees. So the countdown of the Feast of First Fruits this year, and the barley harvest and all that good stuff would begin on April the 9th. April the 9th. So let's get into the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 says, "During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to live in the land of Moab for a while." So during the time of the judges was the 300-year period that followed the death of Joshua. A couple of significant things about that time period was that Israel did not have a king, and there was no temple in Jerusalem, not yet been built. In that time of the judges, there's no king. At the time of the judges was marked by a cycle of unfaithfulness, oppression, deliverance, and then unfaithfulness again. Because of the unfaithfulness God would allow their enemies to oppress them. When they were oppressed, they would cry out to God for help. God would appoint a judge to deliver them from their oppression. And then they would be faithful for a time, usually until the judge died, and then they would return back to their idolatry. The book of Judges ends with this summary. How the book of Ruth starts, it was the time of the judges, a time of constant upheaval, a time of uncertainty, and even so, if you look at the time of the judges, it wasn't a particularly good time for Israel, but even so, this was an even worse time because it was time of judges, and on top of that, you've got a famine. And so, on top of the political instability, the moral waywardness, there's a shortage of food, and you can imagine that this famine that was happening to them, because bad things happened to Israel when they were disobedient, was probably a result of their unfaithfulness to God. God had promised them, if you obey me, if you do keep my commands, then I will send the rain, you will harvest and at the right time and all those good things. But the famine indicates that they were not doing their part at this time. So this family left for the land of Moab. Now Moab was really not that far away. If you look on a map, it was just across the Jordan River. It was about halfway down the Red Sea. And maybe I can use my trusty whiteboard to draw a map really quick, let you know where that was. In case you're not looking at one, but we have roughly the coast of Israel here, and up here you've got the Lake of Galilee, you got the Jordan River, goes down here, and there's a sea called the Dead Sea. Bethlehem is roughly about 6 miles from Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem was not the capital at this time. And so they left to Moab. Now, so we're not a terribly big distance. And so why would they go over there? Well, they're looking for a place that wasn't having a famine, maybe. Maybe they were even looking for a place that was stable, some stability to it. So the plan was to go there until things got better in Bethlehem. Verse 2 of Ruth, chapter 1 says, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the land of Moab and settled there. Now, Ephrath, it calls them Ephrathites here. Ephrath is just an older name for Bethlehem. And so to call them Ephrathites, really Bethlehem. But they were, but that's where their family inheritance was. So they're truly from here. This is where their family's from. This is where their land is. Because if you remember, when Israel came into this land of Canaan, they came over here, they conquered Jericho first, and then they went south and they went north. They conquered the land of Canaan. It was divided up according to tribe and according to family. And there were several things about the land, their inheritance. It could not pass this land to another tribe. It had to remain in the tribe to which it was originally given. That land was to be passed on to every generation of that family, and it could never be permanently sold. It would always revert back to the original owners, and that could be bought back, or if it had been, we'll get into that a little later, but it could be sold. Sort of, the value of the land would be calculated based upon how far it was from the year of Jubilee. Now, the year of Jubilee and all that, that occurred every 50 years. And so when the year of Jubilee occurred, then the land would be returned to its, yeah, I think you understand. The value was calculated from how far the date of the sale of the land was from the year of Jubilee, and it would always revert to its original owners. So there was a reason why the land could never be permanently sold. And that reason was that the land didn't really belong to the tribe that it was given to. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23 says, the land is not to be permanently sold because it is mine. This is God speaking. So God considered this land to be his land. You are only foreigners and temporary residents on my land. So they were not the owners, really. The real owner is God. And they were only steward. The nations around them engaged in what God described as abominations in Leviticus chapter 18. God made it clear that they would be kicked out. That is found in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 28. If you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Now, in the way that the land is treated here, there are two obvious parallels between the promised land and the Garden of Eden. Now, there's more parallels, and if you do a Bible study with me on Genesis, I will point those out to you. But for now, this draws out two parallels. One is Adam didn't own the garden. God did. Adam was placed in the garden not as an owner, but as a steward. He was to work and guard the garden. Now, Israel was placed in the land as a steward. Second, when Adam disobeyed God, what happened to him? He was kicked out of the garden. So here, if Israel is disobedient, they will be kicked out of the promised land. So I say all this because the question of land as an inheritance is going to play a big part in the book of Ruth. And so we need to know a little bit about it. So as Elimelech took his family away, took them away from his inheritance, he must have sold the land for a value calculated from the year of Jubilee. Now, one more thing about this land is that it could be bought back at any time by the rightful owner, and the purchaser, the person who had bought it from them, could not refuse to sell it back. Okay, that'd be for the fair price or whatever, but he couldn't refuse to sell it back if the guy had the money. The other person who could buy it back was someone who was called the kinsman redeemer. Now, he would be a close relative, and he would be given that position of a kinsman redeemer. And we'll talk about more about the roles that a kinsman redeemer was to have. Uh, but that was one of them. So the Hebrew word here is goel, and that is someone who is a kinsman redeemer or near kinsman, whatever your translation will say. We'll talk more about his role as we go through the book of Ruth. So Elimelech sold the family inheritance and he headed for Moab. It's interesting that he didn't go to a tribe of Israel. When he crossed the Jordan on the way of Moab, on the way here down to Moab, he would have passed through, so we're with the color, but probably better. Would pass through the land of Gad and the land of Reuben. So this was the inheritance that was given to two tribes who decided to stay on the east side of the Jordan River. That they were part of Israel, and you think this place wouldn't be so different from this place, so why not just stop here? But he didn't do that. He intentionally goes past those places on down to Moab. See, so he heads this. He sells his family inheritance. He heads for Moab, and they entered the land of Moab and they settled there. In Genesis chapter 19, we find the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So what is this land of Moab? I'll get right to tell you where that starts. If you remember, Lot and his two daughters were rescued from the destruction by that event. I mean, they're being pulled out of the city as God's destroying it, and they're running for the little village of Zoar. Everything around them is burning, and their mother, as they're going, turns around to look back, and she turns into a pillar of salt. So, I don't know if they saw that happen, but very likely they saw their mother turn into a pillar of salt right before their eyes. So these two young girls, everybody that they knew, everything that they knew was destroyed. And this family's so traumatized that they don't stay in the little town of Zoar, what they ran to, but instead they go to the mountains and they go hide in a cave. And Lot's daughters must have been convinced that they and their father were the last survivors on earth. And so they decided to become pregnant by their father. They got them drunk and carried out their plan to become pregnant. The oldest daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab, which literally means from my father. So what we call Moab, we use a hard, whatever thing there, we call it Moab. It literally means from my father, and so Moab's the son of the oldest daughter of Lot. The younger daughter gave birth to a son and named him Ben-Ami, and that means son of my people. And so he becomes the founder of the nation of Ammon, or the Ammonites. So, say all that and say that Moab, the Moabites were somehow distant relatives. They were descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. That wouldn't have been, and so to go to Moab, wouldn't have been so bad except for an incident that happened as the nation of Israel had journeyed to the promised land. If you look in Numbers chapter 22, it says that Israel traveled on and camped in the plains of Moab near the Jordan to the Amorites. Moab was terrified of the people because they were numerous and dreaded the Israelites. So the Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will devour everything around us like an ox eats up green plants in the field." So one of the reasons Balak's king, Balak, the king of Moab, was worried was that he had watched Israel destroy the Amorites. And the Amorites, he had just suffered a defeat from the Amorites. They had beaten him in battle. He now sees Israel come in and wipe out the Amorites. And he's thinking to himself, now, I couldn't beat the Amorites. And these people have beaten the Amorites. So, what are they going to do to me? Nobody's going to stop these guys. So the whole nation of Moab was panicking along with their king Balak. And by the way, that's exactly what Moses said he would do right after the nation of Israel had crossed the Red Sea 40 years earlier than this. In his song in Exodus chapter 15, verse 15, Moses says, "Then the chiefs of Edom will be terrified." Edom's a nation down here, comes from Esau, descendants of Esau. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. Trembling will seize the leaders of Moab. The inhabitants of Canaan will panic. So the Moabites, because they were panicked, they were afraid. I'll add something to my little map here. Somewhere down here. Okay. Now, they were afraid, and so they make an alliance with another nation, the nation of Midian. Midianites, they come from down here. Can't do another M. That's or use it in. But anyway, so down here, there's this branch of the Red Sea. This would be the maybe next week I'll get it done now. But Midian is where Moses fled to when he was fleeing from the Pharaoh of Egypt after he killed the Egyptian, was fleeing for his life anyway. So they go down here and they make an alliance with those people. Now the Midianites, they're also distant relatives. They're descendants from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. And so Midian is the son of Keturah. And with this alliance, the first thing they do is they hire Balaam the prophet. Now, it says that Balaam is from Euphrates, so he's going to be from up here somewhere. He's not He's not from there. They had to go up north and go find this guy. So he's a well-known prophet. And so they go up there to hire Balaam, and Balaam was a real prophet, and he knew that he could. They want to hire Balaam to put a curse on Israel, and so Balaam knows that he can't curse Israel unless God allows him to. Sends up and then offer him all this money, trying to figure out all the way along is how can he get around God's not allowing him to curse Israel. How can he get his hands on all that money that's being offered? Um, and of course, this is the well-known story of the donkey that speaks to Balaam. Okay, it's while he's making his journey down from here to meet with Balak. And so when he gets down there, he instructs Balak to make some offerings to God, and then while Balaam goes to meet with God, and God gave Balaam these words to speak to Balak, and those words are found in Numbers chapter 23, verse 7. So Balaam proclaimed this poem: Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come, put a curse on Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse someone God has not cursed? How can I denounce someone the Lord has not denounced? And then he continues on with his prophecy to bless Israel. Of course, that's not what Balak wanted to hear. And that's also not going to get Balaam what he wants, which is a big pile of money. So neither guy are getting what they want. So he tells Balak, well, here, go over to this other place. You might be able to see him from a different angle here, make some more sacrifices, and I'll go seek the Lord. And so he does this several times, and each time with the same results. God blesses Israel. And so after these failures, there's these words at the end of Numbers chapter 24. It says, Balaam then arose and went back to his homeland, and Balak also went his way. So from that verse, you might conclude that this was the end of it. And Balaam had failed to curse Israel, and he and Balak just gave up and went home. But that's not the end of the story. In Numbers chapter 25, we find out that the Moabite women were coming into the camp of Israel, and they were enticing the men into sexual immorality and Baal worship. And because of that, God sent a plague on Israel, and 24,000 Israelites died in that plague. Of course, there's no hint in Numbers chapter 25 that Balaam was behind all of that. Now, if you were to keep reading that story there and all the things that happens in Numbers chapter 31, God instructed Moses to go to war with Midian. So, these guys down here who have made an alliance with Moab, God says, okay, these guys have got to pay for what they've done. And because they had allied with Moab and conspired together to put a curse on Israel. Of course, I told you some things about Midian here. Midian was the descendant of Abraham's wife, Keturah, her son, and it's also the place that Moses ran to when he was fleeing the Pharaoh. It is the place where his first wife Zipporah comes from. So in other words, he's sort of going to war against his in-laws. Um, but in the war, Balaam was killed. And that's odd because, like I said, Balaam's from up here somewhere near the Euphrates River. Um, so if he had gone home and stayed there, he would have been fine. But for some reason, he's come back down here and he gets caught up in this war against Midian. So as the men had returned from this war, wiping out the Midianites, they brought with them the spoils of war, and one of the things that they brought as the spoils of war were the Midianite women. And so Moses says to them, have you, this is Numbers chapter 31, verse 15, have you let every female live? He asked them. Yet they are the ones who, at Balaam's advice, decided the Israelites to unfaithfulness against the Lord in the Peor incident. That's where they were in chapter 25 of Numbers. Anyway, so the unfaithfulness against the Lord in the Peor incident, so that the plague came against the Lord's community. And then he instructs them to kill all the women who were not virgins, and they could keep the virgins, because they have not, obviously not been part of all of that. So the Midianite women, the Moabite women had been part of this conspiracy against the nation of Israel. Now, as a result of that, God puts a permanent prohibition against any sort of dealing with the Moabites. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. It says, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the Lord's assembly. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, may ever enter the Lord's assembly. This is because they did not meet you with food and water on the journey after you came out of Egypt, and because Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, was hired to curse you. Yet the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but he turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you. Never seek peace or friendship with them as long as you live. So you're never seek peace or friendship with them as long as you live. So, knowing all of that, what do you think about Elimelech intentionally bypassing, these tribes of Israel and going on down to Moab and deciding that was the best place for him to settle? There's this permanent injunction, if you will, against the Moabites. They were to not associate with those people. So continuing on in Ruth, it says Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her two sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion, two sons of Elimelech, also died, and Naomi was left without her two children and without her husband. So, even more shockingly than Elimelech deciding to move down to Moab is his decision to acquire Moabite women as his son's wives. And so this story of Ruth is, amongst other things, it's one of the only two books in the Old Testament named after a woman. And not only is it named after a woman, but in the estimate of the Torah, it is the named after the worst sort of woman. It's named after a Moabite woman. And so that's all that I have for you today. I think that lays a pretty good foundation for beginning to understand some of the things that we'll encounter in the book of Ruth. As far as who the Moabites are, why was it so shocking that Elimelech decided to go down there and settle in the land of Moab? It lays a foundation for us later on to begin to understand, what's it talking about as far as the inheritance. That there's no male heir to possess the inheritance, which was the family. So the land that was there in Bethlehem, and it lays a foundation for understanding the season that all this is centering around, which is the barley harvest. And later on, as we go through the book of Ruth, I'll tie it in a little closer to the Shavuot, and also to Easter, as far as understanding, the construction of the feasts that God had laid out there, and how those things are a prophecy pointing to Jesus. I also talked a little bit today about the kinsman redeemer is, and why is he so significant. So if you watch this, thank you for watching this. We'll continue this next week, and hopefully we'll get a little further into the book of Ruth. And I hope this format's okay. It's a new thing for me. So thank you for watching, and let's close this thing with prayer. Father God, I thank you for everyone who's going to watch this, going to listen to it. And Lord, I pray that you would use this to enrich their lives, enrich their understanding of the wonder of your word and the wonder of your plan. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.